Good afternoon and welcome to the March Community IT Innovators webinar. Thank you for joining us today to learn more about security readiness, probably the single most important IT topic in 2017. My name is Johan Hammerstrom and I'm the President and CEO of Community IT and the moderator for this series. Before we begin, I'd like to tell you a little bit more about our company. We are a 100% employee-owned company with a team of 38 staff that's dedicated to helping nonprofit organizations advance their missions through the effective use of technology. We're technology experts, and in fact, we were recently named the top managed services provider, or MSP, based in Washington, D.C. by MSP Mentor. And with that, it's my great pleasure to turn this over to today's presenter, our CTO, Matthew Eshelman. Matt, good afternoon.
Good afternoon, Johan. Thanks for the intro. It's always great to hear that accolade about the top MSP in DC. I know there's lots of them here in DC and lots in the surrounding area. So it's good to be recognized for the work that we've done over the last 20 couple years. So thanks everyone for joining me today. I appreciate the questions that some of you submitted in advance, and if you do have questions during the webinar, go ahead and feel free to chat them in, and Johan will be kind of moderating that and asking questions as we go along. I do think it'll be a good opportunity to have a little bit of back and forth on some of the topics. So as Johan mentioned, security is, I think, a very big topic in 2017. I personally thought that 2016 was going to be the year of security, and I think we saw it was certainly the year of the impact of poor security. Here you'll see some of the background reading that is kind of core to how we view and see IT security. So at the beginning of last year, we co-sponsored Idealware security report. So there's the link to that. Then we developed our own and published our own security playbook, which is another resource that is available for you to review. And we had a couple of webinars at the beginning of last year that talked about some foundational security concepts. And then towards the end of last year, we internally started using the SANS 20 critical security controls as a framework for us to implement security for our own network and then also for the networks of the clients that we support. So again, these are some good background reading if you want to fill out your learning on this topic of IT security. So we'll talk about the current landscape. So I was fortunate enough to attend the recent RSA security conference, which was held in San Francisco back in February. And that is a conference of 40,000 IT security professionals, and got exposed to a lot of great content. And so these are some of the assessment of the current security landscape that we see. So we are seeing again increasing sophistication in how attackers are operating. We are seeing motivation that hacking is now, it's a financially motivated business. I mean, it's an industry, and we'll see that in a little bit. I mean, this is, hacking. We'll dispel the myth. Hacking is not, some kid in his parents' basement, hacking away for fun. These are increasingly nation-state funded actors or other significantly resourced entities that are doing this as a business and making money, and a lot of it. We're seeing a rise in the increase of credential trading. In fact, there are now whole kind of databases of hacked credentials from all these various breaches over the past couple of years. And so, if a system that you use has been compromised, there's a good chance that those credentials are kind of out there floating on the dark web and being incorporated into some of the automated attacking tools that are out there. We are also seeing increased organization awareness of the risk of security breaches. So I think certainly the impact of the DNC attack and the account compromise of John Podesta's email, I think certainly is highlighted for a lot of organizations just the value that information has, and what can happen if information is kind of publicized outside of how an organization would choose to control it. So I think this year, after that breach happened, we have certainly had a lot more traction in talking with organizations around the need for good password policies, good security policies, and actually being able to impact them, because we have, unfortunately, have very real and concrete examples of what can happen if somebody, an important person in your organization, if their email is compromised, as we saw with the impact, on the election. We're also seeing that IT controls are now showing up more and more as part of financial audits. So the financial audit is reaching beyond just the financial controls and looking into IT security controls. I still do think that overall, as a nonprofit sector, we don't have the compliance requirements that kind of industry or kind of big enterprise does. If you are, healthcare clinic, you will have HIPAA compliance requirements. If you do some credit card processing, there is PCI, but I think PCI has gotten a lot better in terms of acknowledging organizations that are just offloading that credit card processing to big payment gateways, and so there's not a whole lot you need to do, and so there isn't from a compliance and regulatory standpoint a lot that organizations are required to do. There certainly are a lot of things that you should do, but there's no legal requirements. So I think that can be a challenge for nonprofits who are able to take advantage of a lot of great technology tools and I think adopt new technology quickly, but we don't quite have the same requirement or incentive to implement the security controls that that other organizations may be forced to do. And then the other thing I'll just say is that IT security, it feels a little bit like a gold rush right now. It is a big topic. It is important. However, it is very clear that there's a lot of money to be made, and a lot of solutions are being sold. So as an example, I'm just going to throw this picture up. This is a summary overview of the security vendor landscape, and if you can't read it, don't worry, you're not going to be quizzed at the end. But this, I think, just kind of shows just how many different security arenas there are, how many different vendors are there. Managing and understanding all the different solution options really is complex, and it's really hard, I think, to really get to understand which vendors are actually going to give you the solutions that you want. So again, there's lots and lots and lots and lots of security vendors that are out there, all peddling solutions for various aspects of security. So security is a complicated, important, and complex undertaking. Some of the stats that I've heard related to IT security are that I think that really show, I think, just the sophistication of kind of the threats that are out there is that 98% of malware is found only on one system. So that means signature-based antivirus that's looking for this specific file with this signature are basically worthless, because the malware signatures or file attributes are changing, and so polymorphic malware is the rule rather than the exception, and so new security tools are needed to deal with it. So while yes, you may still want to have antivirus, you need to have a solution that has evolved in how it's detecting threats. So 90% of malware is found on only one system. I mentioned business. They're estimating that there will be 1.2 billion with a B, dollars paid in ransomware this year. So I think this helps to illustrate just how big of a business ransomware, kind of cyber, kind of threats are. This is not, some kid in his basement, trying to hack into a system. These are companies or entities that are, funded and, making money at this. So significant increase in the amount of revenue that's out there for cyber criminals to try to take advantage of. And again, it doesn't require some kind of super hacker to build a ransomware system. There's, if you follow Krebs on security, it's a great security website, kind of investigative journalism site, he recently linked to a story where for $400 you could sign up and get access to your own ransomware development and management platform for $400. So, really low cost entry, really rich opportunities to kind of make money, and so you can see how the financial incentive for cybercrime is really there. So in terms of, I think, building an awareness and an understanding about amongst your staff and amongst your users is just really understanding this new security landscape. There's a lot of different elements that are contributing to this, and so at the RSA conference, Dr. Hugh Thompson, who's the CTO at Symantec, he had been at Blue Code and a couple other things. He's a PhD. He teaches at Columbia. Kind of talked about these 5 immutable laws and 4 corollaries of hackernomics. So a social science concerned chiefly with description and analysis of hacker motivations, economics, and business risk. So this is kind of how he framed understanding the adversary that we are attempting to protect our users and our data from. So I think the law, this law 1 is really helpful in understanding the overall kind of framework. Most hackers aren't evil or insane, or they just want something. And the corollary to that is that we don't have the budget to protect against evil people, but we can protect against people that look for weaker targets. So in this case, there's lots of super sophisticated security platforms out there. There's all kinds of encryption modules and physical controls and biometric authentication, and lots of very, very sophisticated approaches to protecting your data. At the end of the day, if you're going to be directly targeted, it's likely that a very motivated attacker is going to get to you or get to that. DeRay McKesson, who is an activist, he did a lot of the right steps, and but at the end of the day, he was a targeted attack, and a hacker basically was able to spoof his Verizon cell phone number and get the redirected PIN codes for his 2-factor authentication. So those are examples of how he was a specific victim of an attack that was very focused and very sophisticated in its approach. I think those again make the news, but I think what we want to focus on is not these really exceptional cases, but we want to focus on, how do we use the limited resources, the limited budget that our organizations have to make sure that, we're not an easy target, and so we're not a victim of the opportunistic hacker that's just kind of walking by, checking all the doors, and jiggling all the locks to see if they can get in. So again, we want to make sure that we are using our budget in the most effective way. And we'll talk about some of those techniques and kind of best practices to follow at the end of this session. The law 2 is, again, security isn't about security, it's about mitigating risk at some cost. And again, in the absence of metrics, we over-focus on risks that are either familiar or recent. Again, there's a lot of sensationalism in security, a lot of things that can kind of appeal to your emotional side about, oh, we should do this because I heard about this or my friend had this happen to them. But there is really an approach and methodology to focus on the risks that are real to your organization, that are likely for your organization, and then focus the efforts on improving your security around those around those events that are most likely for you and your organization. So again, we don't have unlimited budget. We can't buy, every security tool. We can't, protect every system, with 10 different layers of protection. But, we want to mitigate some risk that we know is out there, at a cost that makes sense for us to, as an organization, invest in. Law 3 is that, again, most costly breaches come from simple failures, not from hacker ingenuity. bad guys how can be, however, very creative if properly incentivized. So again, the target breach, is kind of an example of, that wasn't, a really necessarily sophisticated attack. It was that, a target partner, had administrative access onto their network, and the partner's network was compromised. Target had all the security systems in place, but they weren't, essentially, they didn't enable some features, and they didn't get the right alerts out of their security system, and so they were a victim of that, of that security breach. So that's, maybe more an example of, some opportunistic hacking. On the other side, by all reports, the attack against Sony, that was a very, a very incentivized attacker, targeting them basically because of the, the movie that they were producing about North Korea. So it does appear that, that attack, you know, was not opportunistic. They were selected specifically and targeted specifically because of the work that they were doing, and so they had incentivized attacker or adversary on the other side. So again, focusing on raising the overall bar as opposed to thinking about all of the exotic security measures that could be taken to prevent a motivated attacker, helps to put things in perspective. And the law 4, in the absence of security education or experience, people are going to make poor security decisions with technology. I think that's why the RSA Security Conference had 40,000 people attending, and 500 vendors. End users are going to make bad decisions. They're going to install software they shouldn't. They're going to click on links they shouldn't. They're going to forward things that they shouldn't. They're going to make bad decisions about how they're using the technology that they have, and so it's important that security not just be another layer that they ignore or subvert. Systems need to be easy to use securely and difficult to use insecurely. So we need to find a way to make sure that the passwords are easy to use, and so you don't have to remember a 16-character password that's letters and numbers and characters and symbols and no words and no anything. That is going to be something that a user is going to subvert. If you can have a policy where you can give them some simple tips about how to generate a good password that uses some memorable words and that's long enough, that makes it easy for them to remember but hard for a computer to guess, then that's a good way to to improve the security. So again, security needs to be easy to use intuitively. So the graphic here is that both of these things are a green cylindrical can with a shaker top. However, if you shake one on your spaghetti and not the other, you may be in for a very rude surprise in terms of how you are using that delivery device. So in the same way, security needs to be a little bit more intuitive. How can we use the system secure and just out of the box without having to do too much training and explanation or expecting people to read anything? How can they just kind of take their security and go with it? And the final law, again, is attackers usually don't get in by cracking some impenetrable security control. They just look for weak points like trusting employees. So some of the sessions that were talked about in RSA was about penetration testing. So that's the kind of an approach to attacking a network through a variety of means. It could be remotely, over the web, looking for vulnerabilities. But there were a number of sessions that talked about physical threats and walking into buildings or following people up in elevators, walking through office doors and sitting down at unattended computers that are unlocked and plugging in a USB drive and getting access to systems that way. And that's certainly a lot more it's a lot easier to walk in the front door whenever somebody's holding the door for you than it is to guess a bunch of passwords or find some malware or develop some malware that you can deploy against an adversary. So again, in security, you're only as strong as the weakest link, and often the weakest link tend to be, our people and how they're using the technology. And so if we can raise the standard for everybody, then it creates an enhanced sense of security for our entire organization. So I'm going to share something, a number of security breaches that we have seen and experienced. And as I said, while I thought 2016 was going to be the year of security, 2017 has really kind of proved to be that. So we have seen a pretty dramatic uptick in the number of security breaches that for organizations that we work with, starting in November, December of last year, and continuing on through this year. So, so this is kind of an educational event, kind of spurring out of our unfortunate real-world experiences with organizations that have these security vulnerabilities. And so I'll be sharing some specific examples, anonymized, of course, as to how these attacks look and kind of how we can kind of protect ourselves against them. So the most common thing that we have seen, I think, in the last 3 to 4 months is around brute force attacks. So brute force attacks is a way where there is an attack, a bot, so to speak, that is just trying usernames and passwords. And so servers that are connected to the internet and have what's called Open RDP or Remote Desktop Protocol are particularly vulnerable to this because anybody with an internet connection can access those servers and just try usernames and passwords. And while I used to use the analogy of you can think of this as your front door, and there's if you live in the city, hey, there's somebody might try to jiggle your door handle. I think the more appropriate analogy is that you're in a store in Times Square, and you've it's after midnight on January 1st, and there's 1.5 million people trying to find a bathroom, and so it's not a few hundred login attempts against your server, it's thousands and thousands. And so we're seeing security logs get overwritten in a period of days containing several 100,000 failed login attempts against a network. So these systems have gotten I would say very good at that type of attack. And so any server that's connected to the internet and has RDP open is receiving hundreds of thousands of login attempts over the course of a week. And so we've had a couple of cases where clients have had had their servers compromised. So either a staff account or any list of admin accounts, and we can see in the logs the user accounts that these systems are using. So they're using admin, they're using help desk, they're using tech, they're using tech support, they're using tech 1, tech 2. So there are a lot of there's some sophistication built into it, so that these automated systems are just kind of checking and checking and checking and checking, and eventually they may find a system and access it. And so then once that account has been compromised, then you have the problem where you've got an end user account on your network, and as we've seen, a crypto attack can be very damaging even if the user does not have admin rights, because if they can read and write to the file server, then they can encrypt the file, or that user account can encrypt a file. So it's these types of attacks are becoming all too common, and as a result, we've really responded by locking down and changing how systems are accessed remotely. And we'll share some of those steps at the end. So we are seeing, and this goes to basically any enabled account in your network. And so this is another thing where I think it's an ongoing challenge just to manage those lists of accounts, because at nonprofit organizations we tend to have a lot of turnover in staff. And sometimes our process and controls in terms of disabling access is not as tight as we'd like it to be, and so accounts can exist for quite a long time, and it's not, so the more open accounts you have, the more surface area you have in terms of accounts that could be compromised. So taking a look at all the accounts on the network and really understanding what they're used for, who's using them, and how often the password's been changed is an important step. So again, staff accounts and service accounts. So accounts like copier, scanner, mail, all of these kind of generic accounts are also in the list of accounts that we see brute force attacks against. And so there's just these bots that are connected all day, every day, trying to access your systems, and given enough time, they'll eventually be successful. We're also seeing some examples of what I'm going to call credential theft. So credential theft is, it's different than a brute force attack. So a brute force attack is, we're just going to try a combination of usernames and passwords until we get in. Credential theft would be when you have a staff person and they give up their password, either by through some kind of phishing scam, or maybe they use another web-based system. Maybe they had a Yahoo account that got compromised. Maybe they use the same password in their Yahoo account. Maybe they use some other type of web forum, and they use their same email address and password that they do for their for their network login. And so then that can present a problem, because if they're those lists of accounts, as I said, are out there and available. So we had a case where an organization where they got a rather suspicious-looking email from a staff person. It was a kind of a traditional W-2 scam. The accountant or the HR director received an email that said, "Hey, I am looking up some information. Can you please provide me the W-2 information for all the staff?" And that raised some flags, as it should, because they had, kind of done some security training. And so they looked at the message, and when we looked at the message, we determined that, this wasn't an email that came in as spam, kind of from outside the organization. It was an email that actually had come from within the organization, from the actual staff person. And then what we had discovered was that somebody had been accessing their account, and we were able to tell this is an account that had been accessed from several overseas IP addresses, which is kind of a hallmark of some of the security breaches we've seen. And so that account was used not only to try to do a W-2 scam internally, but that email account had also been used to set up several job ads. And then what would happen is that they would, they were basically sitting on this person's account, sending and receiving messages, and then deleting the sent messages and the messages that were received to kind of cover their tracks. But then they created several job ads. And then what would happen is when a job prospect would kind of click on and respond to the job ad, they would get a message back saying, "Hey, this job is not available anymore, but here's another job ad. Please fill out information." And then, so from there, the attack would move from the organization's domain to another organization, or another email domain that looked very, 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 very similar, and they would continue. And so this organization actually had a person, like an AU grad student, show up on their doorstep to say, "Hey, I just got a check from this person at your organization who hired me, and it looks a little strange, and so my mom, told me I should check it out." And so what it turned out that that this was kind of a job scam that had been run a number of times. And so it's the traditional the Craigslist kind of scam where you get into a conversation, somebody's like, "Oh, I'm going to send you a check, I'm going to send you a money order, please deposit, buy stuff, send it to me, or keep some money for yourself," and then you find out that the check is bad. So again, I think this really highlights the risk associated with not having good passwords in place, not changing them regularly, and not having two-factor authentication enabled on your accounts, because you can because you can then be kind of vulnerable to somebody kind of basically tarnishing your reputation of your organization. So it's a really, I think, stark and I think new reminder that, you know, your organization's assets are, really important, email especially, and I think especially with the prevalence of, moving to Office 365, it just makes it a lot easier to, or, Gmail, it makes it a lot easier maybe to log into email systems and access information. So I don't know, Johan, if you wanted to add anything to kind of talking about the issue with credential theft.
Yeah, well, I think you raised a really good point about the risk that ungroomed user accounts can pose to an organization. But I think both the RDP breaches we've seen, as well as the credential theft breaches, point to other sort of outdated, information or information systems that people just kind of lose track of.
Mm-hmm.
So I think, the RDP technology, the terminal server, remote desktop server, was really popular, 10, 15 years ago. And I think a lot of organizations back in the mid 2000s kind of rolled out terminal servers. And in many cases, they're no longer really being used. In fact, we ran into a situation where hackers were the most common login for a terminal server. Like staff, there's only one staff person who was only using it like once a month, but there were a number of hackers who were logging into the machine, on a weekly basis. And I think that's a situation of, again, the IT department had set this system up and just kind of left it there, and it wasn't being actively managed. And the thinking was, well, what harm is it causing? We've already made the investment in building out this server, and it may not get used that often, but what's the harm in it? And I think the new sort of security readiness posture that all organizations need to adopt is that you know accounts that are left open, servers that are left online that are not being actively managed or used, passwords in this case that are not being changed, all pose risks. And in some ways, kind of going back to your hackernomics slides, Matt, those risks that they pose are in many ways, much greater than. It's not going to be some, evil genius, like you said, who found some unusual way of getting into the system. It's, criminals who are incented to take advantage of systems, finding gaps that really kind of arise through carelessness almost. So
Mm-hmm.
I think these are both examples of situations where those hackernomic rules really kind of emphasize that the where the risk lies.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think, in the number of the cases that we've talked now, I mean, the security changes that would be required to prevent these kind of attacks, yeah, I mean, they're not expensive. They don't, take a lot of sophisticated technology solutions, but they do require kind of time, attention, and decision making, on the part of the organization to kind of, yeah, make decisions around account access, make decisions around password policy, do some end user training, yeah, to affect those changes.
Mm-hmm.
All right. So the other kind of attack that I wanted to highlight was just the fact that there are, compromised partner can be compromised partner accounts as well, and those accounts could be, again, accounts that were used for printer management and printer setups. That's kind of a one that we've seen, or or accounts where that were used for certain network services. And in those cases, we had a case where a partner had essentially used a common password across all, kind of all of their clients, and so that password then got compromised, and then that kind of made its way into the list of kind of the dark web, known username and password credentials, and so then that credential was used as part of a number of attacks against networks. So it kind of goes back to the grooming of account lists and understanding, which accounts need to be active, who's accessing them, and how they're being accessed. That really, speak to the true improvements in how you can effectively increase the level of security in your organization. as we talked a lot of this, there's a lot of examples, and we've talked a lot about kind of the different laws, and I think this is another helpful visualization for me at least to kind of understand the changing security landscape. So this was presented at the RSA conference by SANS, which is one of a kind of a industry think tank that provides a lot of security resources. So they have their framework is called this SANS Securing the Human. And they have a bunch of resources that are free and available. So I'd encourage you, if you're looking for security resources, these would be helpful. I have found that the security resources and security frameworks are very heavy and very industry, kind of enterprise centric, and so they are definitely geared towards 30 to 50,000 person organizations with like dedicated in-house teams to kind of fill all these roles, and it doesn't scale down quite so well, but I think it does give a good framework. But again, this was a graphic where you can see the number of security controls implemented kind of on that the left-hand axis, and then along the bottom is years. So this is a representation of Microsoft's operating system. So starting in 2002, Microsoft obviously is the kind of the most or the prominent operating system is the kind of the biggest target for security threats, and as such, Microsoft has made improving security one of their focuses, and so you can see over the last 12 years that they've really included a lot of enhanced security features into their base operating system. So starting way back in 2002 with trustworthy computing, having software restriction policies. In 2004, they rolled out this automatic update, turning on the firewall by default, turning on data execution protection, adding in malicious software removal tool, adding in Windows Defender, kind of providing disk encryption as part of the base operating system, doing App Locker, Microsoft Security Essentials. I mean, they're really putting in a lot of security elements into the base operating system over time. And so, as a Windows user, you've kind of benefited from this pretty dramatic increase in sophisticated security improvements as part of the operating system. However, SANS would say, as the human operating system, how much security training or security improvements have we received as people over that same time? And I would venture to say at most organizations it's probably not that much. Now maybe it's not a flat line at your organization, but in general, we have not seen the level of security training and resources provided to people that we have devoted to technology solutions. And so so SANS has this kind of framework about at level 1, there's no awareness of security at all. Level 2 would be meeting the minimum compliance requirements, because a lot of organizations, if they're publicly traded, have a lot of security compliance requirements. So that would be the minimum, like, hey, we're just doing this because we have to. Then moving up into level 3 as kind of acknowledging, hey, that these are good security practices that are going to help our organization work more effectively and more efficiently, and then kind of moving all the way up to having long-term sustainment and being kind of a metrics-based organization that can incorporate new and changing environments as the security continues to evolve. So again, this is the SANS framework. I'd encourage everyone to take a look at that for a lot of very sophisticated and detailed recommendations. I think what we've tended to do is look at them as a reference point and then scale things down to be more appropriate and understandable for organizations that don't have an in-house chief information security officer. I think some of the other takeaways from the security training is a focus on actually doing it and having specific security training with your staff, and using the framework of the likelihood times the impact to identify the biggest risks. So you can identify a long list of different elements in your organization. So are we concerned about passwords? Are we concerned about encryption? Are we concerned about physical access to our systems? Are we concerned about mobile device management? Are we, what are the different things, from a security perspective that we're concerned with? And then from that point, you can then use, a fairly simple, what's the likelihood of this event happening times what is the impact of this, then to identify your biggest risks. And, for each organization, you may have some different things that are bigger deals. If you've already implemented disk encryption for your laptops, well, maybe you're not really worried as much about having to report a data loss, because if a device is encrypted, you don't have to worry about that. So, but it does help to identify what are the biggest security vulnerabilities affecting your organization, and then you can focus your training on that. And what the SANS trainers would recommend is that, if there's 20 or 30 things in your kind of security list that you're considering, people only really have the ability to focus on, 3 or 4. And so just focus on those top level security things, as opposed to trying to bury people with how they can improve security and maybe all, in all 20 areas. So really focus the training on, the biggest risks, or the things that are going to have the biggest impact in your organization. So in terms of our security best practices that we're, now I think being a bit more forceful in terms of imposing on our clients, it really does start with passwords. So again, password policy, 8 characters a minimum. Longer is, I think, in passwords, longer is better, and because you can. The more bits that you have, the harder it is for computers to guess. So make sure that it's maybe easy for you to remember, but difficult for somebody, for a computer to guess. With a 90-day age, we've gone, taking the step of locking out an account after 5 failed attempts, but then automatically unlocking it after 10 minutes as kind of a balance. Because what we have found with a lot of these brute force attacks, we've actually had to change some account names because they were getting locked out constantly, because they're just subject to, attack after attack after attack. So we've added that requirement into our password policy, and then strongly encouraging 2-factor authentication for the cloud. It's so easy to implement if you're using, Google Apps or G Suite or Office 365 to turn on 2-factor. It's free. It's included with the solution, and having that 2-factor authentication really just gives you a kind of an exponential increase in security, because it goes from just being a password to being a password plus something you have, which is a device or a phone. And then I would also encourage that second factor actually be an authenticator app as opposed to a text message, because that can be kind of spoofed or intercepted, or our phone call. So I really I use both a Microsoft Authenticator and Google Authenticator fairly heavily, and I think it's a great security improvement and something that is relatively easy to do for most web-based or cloud-based applications. Beyond kind of extending that recommendation is around single sign-on for cloud applications, and I think this goes back to some of the complexity that we all have. So used to be IT security was, hey, you had your password to log into your computer, and then everything was in the closet down the hall, and you didn't have separate logins to access everything. You just had a relatively limited set of applications. Well, now I think if you're doing good, you maybe only have 10 logins, but the reality is most of us have logins for 10, 15, 20, 30 different applications, and it's really hard to have good passwords for all of them. So if you can move away from needing to even create unique passwords, and you can instead use single sign-on, where instead of logging into that system, the system is actually using a single sign-on authentication source, then that makes that you kind of shrink down your security footprint. So I like, so Okta is a great option for single sign-on. They have an Okta for Good program that will provide a donation for 25 licenses for nonprofits, and so that's a great option. It's really easy to implement, and it's a very powerful platform, and gives you the ability for single sign-on, so that you can have your password, if you're an on-prem Active Directory, you can link that up, and then you can have the same password to log into all these different. You can just log into Okta, and then from Okta will handle the authentication into the other systems. Microsoft has Azure Active Directory Premium, which is part of their EM plus S suite, which is available for $1.65 per user for nonprofit pricing. And again, that can be used as a single sign-on source. And again, you can really start to cut down on the number of passwords you remember, because once you can integrate these applications via SSO, then all the authentication is happening there. And if you change your network password, then that change gets propagated to everything else, and so you don't have to deal with resetting passwords at all the different applications that you are using.
Hey, Matt. Got a question that's kind of topical. I thought I'd just ask it now. What's your recommendation in terms of single sign-on versus password managers like LastPass or 1Password for organizations?
I think password managers are great and are good to have. I think from a centralized management and reporting and auditing standpoint, I think single sign-on is a kind of a superior framework or point of view to have. So password managers, typically will have kind of a local copy, an encrypted database, and whenever you go to a website, it's kind of copying and pasting in the password into that system. So that's, I think that's good to help you kind of keep or generate secure passwords and then kind of copy and paste them in. But at the end of the day, you're still, maintaining unique passwords, and there are some, there are some security risks, I think, in kind of those systems being compromised. What I like about single sign-on solutions is that if you have single, SSO, let's say integrated with, Box, whenever you log into Box, it's actually logging using your ID that you have through Okta or Azure Active Directory to kind of verify you are who you say you are. And so you don't actually have a separate password for Box. Box is just using your existing single sign-on vendor as the authentication source. And so that gives you a couple of benefits, for organizations, because then you can actually review and see, do some reporting, okay, who is logging into all these applications, and then it gives you the ability to, you can auto provision accounts, you can auto deactivate accounts, you can implement different password policies as an administrator for different organizations, you can implement two-factor through all of that. And so single sign-on like Okta or Azure Active Directory or OneLogin or some of these other things just give you a lot more kind of oversight, management, and control from an organizational perspective than you would get from like an enterprise subscription of KeyPass, where everybody still has their own system and they're kind of managing it, and you're still copying and pasting passwords into 30 different sites.
Great, thank you.
Great, yeah, and thanks for the questions, and certainly appreciate any more. Again, kind of going down the list of our best practices, renaming the admin account, that's the first thing. That's definitely admin, administrator, all of those variants, support. Those are all being that's on the list of the auto password crackers. So it's important to change that just so that you don't even present the opportunity for that account to get compromised. Complex service account passwords. If you have, in a Windows world, if you have accounts that are used to run services and it's hard to change them because you have to restart stuff and things get broken, then you can just, I think you can generate passwords up to 256 characters long and just leave them in there. So that's an approach that we're taking, is that whenever we generate a service password, it's very long, immemorable, and is something we don't actually touch on a regular basis. But because of the length, we're not concerned about that being compromised. I can't kind of stress this enough. Disable inactive and unused accounts. We have developed a couple of reporting tools that allow us to now generate reports on, how long accounts have been active, when the password was last changed, and it's a good exercise to just review, hey, is there a reason why, we still have an account for this user? I thought they left a long time ago. Or, oh, what's this service account? Why is this being used? And often, things get created, test user, test one, copier, printer, as new accounts are getting, or new systems are getting set up. And it's important to have a good process to kind of come back and clean those up because, the test account that you used, maybe you didn't think it was a big deal, but if you just had test and password or password 123, I can assure you that that is an account that's probably going to get compromised because it's a common combination it's on the list. And again, remote access, we really are, I think, given the experience that we've seen of these brute force attacks against RDP, really locking that down so that it's not as easy for these external bots to just kind of try thousands and thousands of logins. So there's a couple of kind of minimal steps enabling network level authentication for RDP. That's something you can do right now. It's just a checkbox, and that kind of puts an extra step in front of logging in. It's not really that much of a change for an end user, but it makes it's a big change from automated perspective. Restricted access for server admins. If you're using RDP for administrative access, that really should be, kind of behind a VPN or behind a restricted set of source IPs that like, if you're an IT person, you could put your home IP to manage your servers, but don't open it up to the world. Putting RDP, if you're still using it, behind a firewall, either SSL VPN or implementing an RDP gateway, which actually tunnels the RDP traffic through HTTPS. And so, I mean, it's amazing. We've done a number of these transitions where, before the change, we will see, thousands of logins per hour, or login attempts per hour. Once we turn on some of these settings, that goes to 0. So, these changes are effective in terms of reducing the surface area for these types of attacks. And again, kind of going cloud, as Johan mentioned, a lot of these terminal servers are not used as heavily anymore as more and more applications have kind of gone out to the cloud. And so, if you have a terminal server on site because of, you've always had one or somebody used to use it, it's good to just reevaluate, is this actually in use anymore? Why do we need it? And, if you've switched a lot of applications to the cloud, maybe a good opportunity to get rid of it. And I think the thing about the cloud is that there's a lot of security that is inherent into it. And while it may seem maybe more vulnerable because it's a single spot or it's kind of already native to the internet, I think because of that, the security improvements can be done a lot more quickly. I think there's the recent security breach in the news was Cloud Bleed. So it was a web content distributor called Cloudflare had some kind of vulnerability that caused a buffer overflow and security information to be leaked. And after they were notified, they basically had a workaround in under an hour and fixed it in less than 8 hours. And so I think the degree to which security these vendors can react to security issues from a cloud vendor perspective is much more quickly than you can react if you had to go and patch all of the systems in your organization or look for vulnerabilities and kind of figure out all this stuff and kind of how it all works together. So I think the cloud has the benefit of a lot more resources available to address these security concerns when they are going to arise. And I think that's the other message to take away is like, assume breach, assume that these things are going to happen. Security is not perfect. Even if you, have this great password policy and have single sign-on and do all this other stuff, like something could happen. Like this isn't, kind of a magical list of things that if you do all this, you're never going to have any security issues. But understanding that's a process and things are going to, could potentially change. It's an important kind of and maybe an unfortunate aspect of security is that it's an ever-changing landscape and the attacks are going to change. And so this is our recommendations for now, but this list is going to evolve and change over time. And again, maybe the final bullet point here, maybe this should have been the first, is security awareness training for staff. Just having that conversation with staff about what do we do whenever somebody asks for a wire transfer? How do I handle a request for an employee's W-2. What do I do when I have an email that looks kind of funny? Kind of the popular term that's now popping up is the human firewall. So I'm not sure what I think about it yet, but I think it's acknowledging the fact that you know your staff with their laptop. I mean that's the network security perimeter. And so if they're making good decisions, you have a really secure perimeter. If they're making bad decisions about technology, then you're going to have a really poor security perimeter. So again, security awareness training for staff is probably the best money that you can spend in terms of improving your overall organizational security. So some of the things that we have as part of our security toolkit at Community IT are foundational, so Windows and third-party patching. So while Windows has made improvements, it's still a source of vulnerabilities. Third-party patching, unfortunately, I think represents an ever-growing area for risk. So that's why we do third-party patching for all the endpoints that we are managing. So that's Flash, Java, Acrobat Reader, all kinds of things where there are security vulnerabilities. Inbound email security. So we use a service from Barracuda that provides scanning of attachments. It's actually it'll preemptively scan links and email. Actually visit the website that the link references and validate it before it even comes to you. So there's lots of great technology tools. We have this actually over a year ago we switched to WebRoot, which is a much more sophisticated antivirus platform than a traditional signature-based solution. So they kind of recognized this change a couple of years ago and kind of totally rewrote or reinvented their antivirus platform, and so we have adopted them over the past year. So that's in our toolkit, and then we also have gotten some third-party malware scanners with some auto remediation. So in our kind of overall device management platform, if we do see that there's some kind of malware or other suspicious software, we can kind of automatically kick off some auto remediation processes throughout our platform that can provide some immediate or more quickly respond to security issues. We use a tool called LabTech, and that gives us the endpoint management for all the devices, and then through there we have the ability to generate some on-demand reports where we can generate password age for all the accounts in Active Directory. We can generate reports on privileged users. So again, who's in the domain admins group, who's in the enterprise admins group, and then present that in a format that's really easy to read that you can go and review and say, hey, is there a reason that Jill Smith is a domain admin? Like, that doesn't make sense why she's in there. So that's a great report. And then the one that I'm particularly impressed with that my colleague developed is called a successful login with geolocation. So what we're able to do is report on the IP addresses that are connecting to systems, and then use an API to do a geo lookup to see where that IP is coming from. So for us, this has been a helpful tool in kind of identifying active breaches, because for most of our organizations, they don't have staff that are working overseas, and so if we see an IP address connecting to their network from from Russia or from Nigeria or something like that, that's a big red flag, and so we're able to then kind of block that account or block those connections. We've also taken the next step of we're now a partner with an organization called CrowdStrike. So CrowdStrike is the organization that actually the DNC called in after their breach to do all the remediation and follow-up. So it is a very sophisticated and powerful tool that is kind of backed. It's not just a piece of software that looks for indicators of compromise, but it's also backed by a team of security researchers, and so they can so if there's a security issue, they can also review it and give us a call. And so we've had a couple of cases where this has been a really invaluable tool in fighting back against some account breaches that we've seen and observed. So so CrowdStrike is a fantastic product, and it's 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 saved our bacon on a couple of on more than one occasion, and I'm a big believer in and it is a sophisticated security platform that really provides a tremendous amount of value. It's stuff that the antivirus didn't detect. It's stuff that malware stuff didn't detect, but this was was able to detect and stop an in-progress crypto attack, an in-progress account escalation attack. So it's pretty amazing stuff. And again, we're also adding in security awareness training, where we can work with organizations to do phishing campaigns against staff to see kind of who's clicking on stuff, and then beyond just, hey, given some reporting on who's clicking on it, also provide some kind of point of click training, so some web-based and online courses on how to recognize different security risks and some good practices in terms of password development and other security policies. So that's something I'm really happy that we're going to be adding in, because as I mentioned on the previous slide, I think the end user, the security awareness training, is really the best value in terms of limited IT dollars. Where do we spend it? Do we spend it on a sophisticated technology solution like CrowdStrike? Hey, I think that's a great idea. But if you can spend a little bit less on some security awareness so that people aren't clicking on stuff in the first place, that's probably even a better way to go. So, Johan, are there any more questions? I know we're kind of at time here, but I'm happy to answer any other questions before we kind of wrap up and talk about our upcoming webinar.
Yes, actually, if you want to go ahead and just head on to the next slide, I'll just quickly announce that, and then we can get to questions. We do have a number of questions left, and thank you to everyone who was able to stay for the entire webinar. We will spend a little bit more time answering questions. If you do have to go, we are publishing the recording of this entire webinar on our YouTube channel, so you can head over there tomorrow if you want to hear any Q&A, and just kind of skip ahead to minute 60 of the webinar. We'll also be publishing the slides onto the our SlideShare account, and the links to both of those are on our website. So, a lot of the links that we've shown in this webinar to various resources, those will be available in that slideshow, and you can get them there. So let's answer a few. Oh, the upcoming webinar. We're going to do a deeper dive into single sign-on. Single sign-on is, in our view, becoming a must-have technology solution, both from a security standpoint, but also just from a basic identity management standpoint. 15 years ago, before the cloud, you had your Active Directory server, and you use that to manage all your user accounts. Now you have staff with user accounts in Office 365, in Google, in Salesforce, QuickBooks Online, and on and on and on. And single sign-on has kind of emerged as the way to manage all of those different accounts. So we're going to go into more detail on that. In April, we've moved our webinars to Wednesday. Hopefully it gives you something to look forward to in the middle of your week. So we look forward to you all joining us on Wednesday, April 19th. So let me get to some of the questions here. Let's see, the first ones we had were really around antivirus. And a couple questions: what are sort of the pros and cons of going with a full-fledged enterprise AV solution like Webroot or Symantec, ESET, etc., versus using like the AVG free or the Windows Defender that comes now with Windows 10? If you want to speak to that a little bit, Matt.
Yeah, I mean, I would probably start off by saying that, there's been a number of studies that have been done, and I mean, basically antivirus is only 50% effective, like at its best, even with I feel like the solutions that we have. So antivirus isn't going to be the end of the story. I would say the real value in a solution, a quote unquote enterprise level solution, is the ability to do reporting, kind of managing and auditing on those systems. So even if your antivirus is only 50% effective, like, that's if it's on. And so if you have out-of-date definitions, if the system is not running, then you're going to be performing at even less than that. So if you just have standalone antivirus that, as an IT person, you can't review, and you don't have a way to manage and report and ensure that it's getting the most up-to-date definitions and it's running scans and it's doing all of that, then that's basically worthless. And so so that's why I would say it's worth investing in a solution, like a contemporary enterprise management system. I think Defender is probably fine, but again, I think it's like Defender plus System Center or some other way to manage and report on the fact that the system is actually doing what it's supposed to be doing is the real differentiator there.
Yeah, and I think it does really bear repeating that the conventional wisdom now is that antiviruses, even the best ones, are really only going to be effective about 50% of the time. And that's why you really need sort of an entire set of security policies uh, to really protect your network. It's probably worth mentioning also that we're starting to see the emergence of sort of next generation endpoint protection. So the endpoint being your server, your workstation, your desktop, your laptop, and solutions like CrowdStrike or Cylance are starting
Mm-hmm.
to look at the behavior patterns. So the traditional antivirus works by looking at definitions. So it examines all of the executables that are trying to run on your machine, and it recognizes the code of executables that are malware. But the next generation of endpoint protection is kind of looking at patterns of behavior. So someone who might be using legitimate software on your machine, but using it to hack into your machine, traditional antivirus can't detect that. So, the next gen is really trying to kind of crack that net, so to
Mm-hmm.
speak. So, I mean, I think yes, it's if even though it's only effective maybe 50% of the time, you'll be glad you have it when that 50% of the time, comes calling to you because it will detect a lot of the crypto wall viruses, and the last thing you want is, well, I'm not going to worry about antivirus, and then you have all your files encrypted by crypto
Mm-hmm.
wall or crypto locker. So um, it's good. It's good to have. It's good to have.
Mm-hmm.
Let's see. Another question, Matt, about just sort of communicating to staff about security threats and just kind of, I think everybody on this webinar is here because they have some concern about security and they're probably very attentive to it. But that's probably not the case for a lot of the staff in an organization. How do you raise that awareness?
Yeah, and I think it's a challenge, and I don't think we've necessarily solved it. And I mean, I will say that for better or for worse, like when there is a security vulnerability, like people all of a sudden pay attention, and you know, uh, so I do think that using contemporary examples that hit close to home is a good way of getting attention. I mean, I think certainly for us, like the DNC, hack of Podesta's email, like that hits close to home, and organizations, I think, get like, hey, if my email, kind of got out there and was, leaked in a way like that I couldn't control the message, like how would that reflect on my organization? I think security is personal, and so telling those stories, again, like the example about the W-2 phishing, like, yeah, how would the organization look if your email account was used to run a job phishing or a job scam on you know kind of the unsuspecting public? And so I think security does need to be personal and relevant, and I think people need to feel like, hey, like what they're doing is going to make a difference. And I think unfortunately, we have a lot of good examples of how lack of attention of security really has negatively impacted an organization. So I would say make it personal. The other thing I would say is that it really is easy to just kind of get overwhelmed if you're like following all the security stuff, but just like the sheer amount of like crazy stuff that seems to be coming out, on a daily or weekly basis. And so I think it's easy to get kind of overwhelmed and overrun by just like, oh my God, like, oh, here's like another security vulnerability. Okay, what are we going to do now? Um, so I think if you can kind of focus on, hey, here are the things that we're going to do as an organization to improve our security, and these are things that we can control, and like, we're going to have a good password policy. We're going to use two-factor authentication, and we're going to encrypt our laptops. Like, if you do that, um, I think you get like 90% of the way there. And, you know, if you're, really, really concerned about security, or you have particularly sensitive information that you want to, protect, then, I think there's some additional steps that you can take. But, you know, just focusing on the things that you can reasonably achieve, good password policy, two-factor, let's clean out the accounts that we're not using. I mean, I think that tends to be the response. We send out these security bulletin alerts every once in a while that kind of raises that level. But at the end of the day, the solution is, hey, make sure you're resetting your passwords, make sure you've got a good password policy in place, make sure you're using two-factor. And so if the response is always the same, let's just make sure we're doing that in the first place. And then, this kind of tide of negative news can not seem so overwhelming.
Yeah, and I think it's important to remember that a lot of the recommendations that we made don't always have like an immediate impact, but they kind of protect you over the long run. And I think part of the fatigue that sets in with people is, you hear about these hacks, the Yahoo breach, all the Yahoo information was leaked, the Dropbox breach, all the Dropbox usernames and hashed passwords were leaked. And I think there's a fear, like when that information, that news, is released out into the media, and certainly the media tends to sensationalize it. And then after a week or two, your identity hasn't been thieved, and your work account hasn't been hacked into, and you sort of let your guard down, like, okay, phew, I guess that Yahoo hack didn't affect me. It's important to remember that oftentimes those breaches are being announced months or years after they actually took place. And the information that's been stolen has been sitting out on the internet for months or years. And even like if with the cloud bleed leak from a couple of weeks ago, even if that information has only been out there for a week or two, the effects may not be realized for another year or so, because basically all this information as it gets released ends up going into these massive databases that are used by hackers to try to hack into systems. And so, you may not realize that, hey, you're using the same, you're using the recovery, your work email is your recovery email, and the same password that you use for your work password on Yahoo. You may not get hacked into right away, but at some point, someone may try that information, and that's when your account will be compromised. So all of these recommendations to have strong passwords, to rotate passwords frequently, to not use the same password with a variety of cloud services, to rely on something like single sign-on, those kind of protect you over the long run. And you can kind of rest a little bit easier when you hear about these breaches, knowing that, okay, maybe Yahoo did get my user account and password from 2 years ago, but it doesn't matter because I've changed my password since then, and I've never used that other password, in any other way. So that's kind of what the security mindset gives you. The sense that you have a understanding of how these things work, and how the posture you adopt can kind of protect you from the activity that's going on. Because it's most likely that you're not being specifically targeted by anyone, but rather you're going to be taken advantage of if you have your guard down by these criminal networks. That's kind of the main threat that I think most small and medium-sized nonprofits and individuals face these days. And so if you kind of just communicate at that level to your staff, you can really, I think, get their attention. And then obviously you have to reinforce it with some organizational policies that do, here's the punchline, Matt, requires buy-in from the leadership. So that's always, at the end of the day, something that's going to really help this. But if you can go to your leadership and say, hey, I sat in on this webinar, and this company has seen like weekly breaches of small nonprofits who weren't paying attention to these things, that might get their attention.
Mm-hmm.
Sorry for my little soapbox there, Matt.
No, I think, well, as part of it, the CEO of Community IT, it's good. We have executive buy-in. It's good to hear. So
Yes, no, it's something that I'm very attentive to, very attentive to. And I think actually that takes care of all of our questions. Let me just check here. I think we hit all the high notes. Well, thank you very much, Matt. This was fantastic, very informative, and I want to thank everyone for joining us today. And we're happy to answer additional questions if you have them after the webinar. You'll be receiving an email from us um, with the links to the recording and the slides. And when you exit from the webinar, you'll be getting a little pop-up survey, and we really appreciate the time you could take to fill that survey out. So thank you, Matt, and I will see you all next month for the single sign-on webinar.
Great. Thank you. Looking forward to it.
All right, take care.